So, TJ, let's dive in and talk about the first chapter of the book, which is about trauma.
Yeah, it's interesting because when I first read my book, when it was complete, I honestly had a moment where I thought, whoa, I don't know that I'd want to keep moving after the beginning sections because, in a lot of ways, many people have been running from their trauma or maybe afraid to look at it. To me, it's one of the deep root causes of addictive behavior. And as I said before, addiction is not the problem, it's a solution to something. So many of us are managing our unresolved trauma by drinking or using or some other behavior to kind of avoid or escape. And what we're inviting now to get into the trauma is to really take a deep dive and go into how that trauma is trapped in our body and how it's affecting our lives.
Absolutely. And I think one big thing for me when I was doing conscious recovery and for the people that I've helped with conscious recovery, oftentimes what comes up in the beginning is, why are we dealing with trauma first? Because most times trauma isn't addressed until later on in the treatment process.
Absolutely, and there's kind of this common wisdom, if you will, that we don't really look at the trauma. You'll get a trauma specialist later, and that's fine for many people. What I have seen for a large percentage of people that are coming out of an addiction, trauma is one of the driving forces. And so for us to not actually create a space to take a look at that trauma is actually a disservice. And in my own experience, I spent so many years avoiding the trauma, bearing the trauma, and it really came from a belief that I didn't have the strength to look at it, and it was easier for me to just table that or to bury that or just not today. But what I've seen is people having relapse after relapse, coming back to treatment multiple times, and at the core of that is this fear of really taking a look at their trauma.
Another interesting thing is that I feel like a lot of people may not necessarily know what trauma looks like. You know, a lot of times people assume that trauma has to be physical, but I was wondering if you could shed some light on the different types of trauma.
Absolutely. So a couple of things I'll say about that. One, in conscious recovery, we identify that there's an Indian proverb that says we're like a house with four rooms: physical, mental, emotional, and spiritual. So trauma lives in those different rooms as well. The other piece that I think is really important is there are things that are obvious trauma, right? Someone's in a car accident, sexual abuse, physical abuse, and those are obviously trauma, and we're not minimizing that. But there's this whole other level of trauma that quite often doesn't even get identified as a traumatic experience. Coming into this world as a whole and perfect spiritual person and being not seen as that, that's a traumatic experience, and that causes separation and that causes shame.
And then lastly, I wonder if you had any advice for people who are nervous about going into their trauma, because it can be a very difficult, it can be very uncomfortable and very scary process. So I'm wondering what advice you could give them.
Yeah, thank you for that, because it is really important. We're not in this part of conscious recovery asking someone to go back and re-experience their trauma. We're really taking a look at what the traumatic experience that has happened, how that's still locked in our body, and how that's connected to our addiction. So there'll be opportunities throughout the entire experience that is conscious recovery to really begin to heal from the trauma. We're really in the beginning asking someone to start identifying what some of the traumatic experiences they had in their life, how that is impacting them today, and how that is connected with their addiction so that we can start to heal that.
Awesome.
I'm curious actually to ask you, Jeremy, what your experience of trauma has been, either for your own in your own journey or in working with clients, because I know you've worked conscious recovery yourself and you've also adopted conscious recovery at your treatment program, and I know you've seen a lot of people work through the process.
Absolutely. So early on in my journey of recovery, trauma was not addressed at all. I did a very traditional treatment program wherein the work was mostly based around meetings and working steps and going through a process, but not once was trauma really addressed. And because I was never a victim of sexual abuse or physical abuse, no major accidents or injuries, I just assumed I didn't have trauma. And what my experience was through conscious recovery was that I discovered that so much of my childhood involved heavy trauma that I didn't even know was there. My dad was gone for most of my childhood, working and, providing for the family, but he was gone. And, my parents were also divorced, a few years after. So there was a lot of trauma that was absolutely affecting me in my life that I didn't even know was there until I read about what trauma really looks like. I know with clients that have done conscious recovery in my treatment program, the biggest differentiator is a lot of them express an insane amount of relief, being that they're able to finally address these things, even though it's their third or fourth time in treatment. They've never talked about these things. And by addressing them through the lens of being a whole and perfect being, they don't feel ashamed or guilty or less than because of their trauma. They feel empowered to take care of it.
Yeah, you're speaking to something that's really important, because when we recognize the wholeness that's underneath it all, we can then move into, I've had these traumatic experiences, but they don't need to define who I am.
Absolutely.
The other piece that's really important that you talked about is there is often a fear of, if I look here, if I speak it, if I begin to address this, maybe I'm going to be overwhelmed with the feelings. So there's a sense of burying it is easier than bringing it forward. What actually happens, I would say about 100% of the time, is when people do create a safe space to be able to start working through and bringing up the experiences, there's a profound healing that happens. And yes, it can be painful. When I started working, for example, through my own sexual trauma, yes, it was painful. It was important, though, for me to bring that forward, and I came to a place where I recognized, yes, that happened to me, but I no longer need to have that define me. The paradox was, when I wasn't talking about it and wasn't addressing it, it was defining me. So many times people believe the opposite. We understand that. One of the key components to conscious recovery is compassion. Compassion, creating a space where someone can compassionately take a look. This isn't about, as my friend Mackenzie Phillips says, this isn't about ripping off the Band-Aid and re-traumatizing yourself over and over again. This is about creating a safe space to start to take a look and recognize that it doesn't have to control our lives.